This video is intended to serve as an overview of the structure of the skin. The skin is your body's largest and heaviest organ and is part of the integumentary system. As we consider the skin, we want to take a look at the structure of the epidermis, the outermost layer that is made of stratified squamous epithelium. We then want to move deeper and look at the structures of the dermis. The dermis is composed of connective tissue, but there are many different things found within the dermis that we need to discuss. Structurally, underneath or deeper in the skin, we have the hypodermis. Hypodermis is not technically part of the skin as an organ, but it is almost always shown on the pictures when we're looking at the structure of the skin. So this is a good place for us to discuss the hypodermis as well. This picture needs to be a picture that you really spend some time looking at. It can show you so much that you need to know about the structure of the skin. First, identify the difference between the epidermis, dermis, and the hypodermis. Notice the dermis is composed of cells that are all touching each other, and these are stratified squamous epithelial cells. Notice as the epidermal cells get more and more superficial, the look of the cells start to change, and that is because this is when we start to see more and more keratin being put into those cells, giving us a nice waterproof layer for our skin. Also notice the bottom, more deep layer of the epidermis has some squiggle to it. That's a very technical term, some squiggle. But the reason I point that out is I want you to see that it's not a perfect flat layer. The dermis has structures called dermal papillae that move up almost like fingers, and that kind of pokes into the epidermis, so you get this nice structure. Notice that hairs are actually an extension of the epidermis. So if you follow the epidermis, you can see this layer, this deepest layer of the epidermis, actually goes around this sebaceous gland and down around the hair. One thing you should remember from your studies of the tissues is that epithelial tissue can rapidly regenerate. So we know that the epidermis, that's the layer of our skin that is constantly being remade, and we're sloughing off the outer layers, but also realize and consider that your hair grows as well. So that should help you remember that your hairs are actually an extension of the epidermis. Notice within your epidermis you have sweat pores, and that's because our sweat glands, we'll find those here in a minute inside of the dermis, but we need the sweat that's produced to actually have a exit port, so that it's going to exit out of sweat pores in the epidermis. Now let's look at structures found in the dermis. The dermis is composed of connective tissue. Within the dermis, we see blood vessels, that's those red and blue lines. We see eccrine sweat glands. Those are going to exit out of a sweat pore. We see sebaceous glands. Those are always going to be associated with a hair follicle because they're going to produce oil for our hair. We have some different receptors inside of our dermis that are typically pressure receptors. So they help us to sense touch and different things of that nature. Here's a great example. This is a Pacinian corpuscle. We have one last type of gland for me to point out inside of the dermis, and that is an apocrine sweat gland. The apocrine sweat glands are typically going to be a little closer, and they're going to exit out of that hair follicle as well. So again, this is a great picture for you to use as reference. Continuing our discussion of the structure of the skin, there are actually two different types of skin that we can describe that differ in their structure. We have thick skin and thin skin. As you would expect, thick skin is thicker. It's thicker because it has an extra layer of epidermis. It is found only on the palms of our feet, palms of our hands, the soles of our feet, and of course those corresponding fingers and toes that are attached. Thin skin is typically covering the rest of our body. The easiest way to distinguish between thick and thin skin is that thin skin is going to have hair follicles. So let's focus in a little bit closer at the structure of the epidermis. The epidermis, as I mentioned, is composed of keratinized, stratified squamous epithelial cells. It is avascular because it's an epithelial tissue. Within the epidermis on a microscopic level, we do have a couple of different cell types. I will discuss these different cell types in more detail in the function lecture. But structurally, just to mention, the 5 types of cells found in the epidermis are keratinocytes. They make the keratin that gives our skin its ability to waterproof. We have stem cells found in the deepest layer that are going to be what we consider undifferentiated. These are the cells that are able to undergo mitosis and help us to continue to regenerate new skin cells. Melanocytes produce melanin. This gives our skin pigment. Tactile cells, these are our touch receptors. And then dendritic cells, these are our immune system cells. On the microscopic level, this shows you different structures of the epidermis. The epidermis has several layers. The deepest layer, that is a single layer, is the basal layer, stratum basal. This is the area where you have your stem cells. Now moving more superficial, we have a nice thick area known as the stratum spinosum. These are our cells that are really making up the bulk of our epidermis. Moving further out, stratum granulosum for grainy. Now we're getting into a thinner layer here where we have more melanin deposited, so that's why they look grainy. If this is thick skin, and we will see the stratum lucidum. This is that layer that is only present in thick skin. And then the outermost is the stratum corneum. The stratum corneum is composed of completely dead cells that are full of keratin. This is a picture of thick skin, and we can tell because of the presence of that stratum lucidum, but also because the stratum corneum is so thick. If this were thin skin, we would see hair follicles protruding through, and the stratum corneum would be thinner. In your notes, please make sure you spend time reading the complete description of each of these layers. Now let's look at the structure of the dermis. Since the dermis is composed of connective tissue, we see fibers. We'll have mainly collagen fibers, but also some elastic and even some reticular fibers. A lot of blood vessels because this is a connective tissue. Different types of glands. This is where our hair follicles will sit, but remember the hair follicles are an extension of the epithelial tissue. The dermal papillae, that was the upward finger-like extensions of the dermis that protrudes and pushes on the epidermis. Just like the epidermis, the dermis is divided into layers, but we only have 2 layers. The outermost or more superficial layer is the papillary layer. This is where your dermal papillae are located. The deeper, more thick layer is the reticular layer. The reticular layer is dense, irregular connective tissue. So if we flip to an image, starting where you see the pink there outward, that is epidermis. The blue is the dermis. So you might be able to tell if you really look at this, you can see around here, this boundary, it starts to get a little denser as you get deeper. Where you have these dermal papillae, this blue area sticking and protruding, pushing out to the epidermis, that is the papillary layer. And then this denser layer that's darker blue, that is the reticular layer. Briefly, the hypodermis, though it's not technically part of the skin, is a layer of connective tissue under the skin composed primarily of adipose tissue. Every person has a different amount of adipose tissue in their hypodermis. This is where we store what we call our sub-Q or subcutaneous fat. That concludes our overview of the structure. Make sure you watch the video to get more detailed information on the function of the different parts of the skin.